Hey everyone, I'm Jay Shear, and you've joined Business Minds Coffee Chat. This is where remarkable people gather to share insights, lift and inspire, and deliver actionable content. Have you ever set a goal and struggled to achieve it? Maybe you've attempted to shed a few pounds, learn a new skill, or achieve an industry certification. Well, on this episode, we're going to be talking about the hidden secret that you might just be missing in the pursuit of your goals. Here's a hint. What we see affects more than what we see. Our guest is a social psychologist and associate professor of psychology at New York University, whose research uncovers how the motivations, emotions, needs, and goals people hold impact the ways they perceive, interpret, and react to information around them. She's authored over 70 scientific publications and books, has received numerous awards for her work, and her research has been featured in dozens of TV, radio, and print outlets around the world, including Forbes, Newsweek, Time, and Scientific American. She has appeared as a host for National Geographic, a guest on MSNBC and NPR, and her TED Talk has been viewed over 3.8 million times. I probably contributed 10 of those views. Please welcome the author of Clearer, Closer, Better, How Successful People See the World, Emily Balcetis. Emily, it is so great to see you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm grateful for you. So I believe that I heard that your drumming style mimics that of John Bonham. Is that true?
Maybe if you ask my mother, but in the real world, no.
Okay. Well, that is a reference to the book. So for those of you that are watching and listening, make sure that you go out and buy this book. And we're certainly going to be talking a lot more about that during this interview. So, Emily, tell us a bit about your backstory and what inspired you to become a social psychologist.
Well, for the last 20 years, I've been studying motivation. And of course, there's so many people and so many, literally hundreds of years and thousands of strategies that people have been trying to investigate to help people and organizations to better meet their goals. And yet we still don't have the answer, right? Because every 1st of January, we set New Year's resolutions personally, or every quarter we evaluate where we hope to be professionally with ourselves and with our team. And oftentimes we come up short. That's why we reset those New Year's resolutions. That's why we have to better calibrate our goals, because the strategies that we're using oftentimes aren't helping us cross that finish line consistently or within the time frame that we're hoping. And so really the 20 years of work that I've been doing is trying to unpack, well, why is that the case? And the obvious answers that we all thought of are just not true. People do care. People do mean it when they set a new goal. People are working towards them. So it's not about trying hard enough. It's not about not really meaning it. It's that the strategies that people are using are oftentimes the wrong ones. And that's what we've been trying to unpack, my research team that I lead. And I have really been trying to figure out, where are those obstacles that people can't see for themselves? And what are the solutions that they don't even know about, that if they could only learn them, if they could only see them, might actually help them circumvent those obstacles and make more progress than they ever have before?
Yeah, well, it makes perfect sense. So I want to go backwards a little bit in time. So were there some early lessons from your childhood that helped to shape the work that you do today?
Wow, you're really putting me out on the couch there, Freudian style, back to my childhood. I think probably definitely. I definitely can think back to some. Music is a big part of my family. First of all, my sister is a professional musician. My parents are both very musically inclined and play many instruments and sing and taught us music from when we were very young. And that really, for the entire family, is an endeavor that's set up to fail. Nobody wants to listen to a child learn how to play violin for the first many years that a child is playing violin, or in my case, saxophone. That was my first and second instrument. I played piano and saxophone when I was first starting out. Piano is a little more tolerable because it's really hard to make that not be in tune, but it's very easy to make a saxophone squawk and be, completely noxious for the family. So really, that is an experience that is set up to fail, that it takes a long time before anything good can come out of that, before you see progress for yourself or for the family that's supporting you.
Mhm.
And I would say that's probably my first hands-on experience with facing obstacles, trying to figure out how to maintain that motivation despite the lack of seeming progress or the lack of positive reward, for sure, for a very long time. And how can you see it through? In the end, I ended up getting a bachelor's of fine arts in music performance. And my sister, like I said, is a professional musician. So our family structure figured it out somehow, as many families do. But it was not one that came easy for me anyway.
Well, that's what a wonderful experience, and I have no doubt that those experiences that you did have set you up for success today, and certainly gives you a deeper appreciation for the work you're doing and how you're serving.
I think scrappy is a term that I would use to define myself. Yes.
I like that. Okay. Well, by the way, I did play clarinet. Don't tell anybody, but I understand that squawking sound. I was never good at it. So, so in your book, you offer 4 powerful visual strategies to reshape the way that we see the world and how we can use them to our advantage for setting and achieving goals. So we're going to be discussing each of those, but before we do, would you share with us the experience that you had bringing this book to life?
Yeah, absolutely. This was a project that, like most big endeavors, I had completely planned the timeline wrong. I thought that I would be much more efficient at this experience than I was. This was a project that I thought, you know what, I'm going to give myself 18 months, and I will see this from start to finish within that time frame. Well, after 18 months, I had gone through 9 versions of the proposal of this project, working with my agent, and each one of those was about 100 pages, single spaced, and every iteration dropped about 80% of the content that had been included in the previous draft. So I feel like I wrote this book about 10 times, the 10th being what actually appears with its brilliant yellow cover. So I completely misunderstood what this process would be like, and I guess overconfidence would define my experience right at the outset. But in the end, it was really a remarkable experience because the book is just so much better for it. There's like lots of experts came in to shape the content, to help me find that narrative thread that really would resonate with people, regardless of what their goal is, regardless of what domain they're trying to work on, whether they're trying to improve teams functioning, whether they're trying to, run their 5K for the very first time, or whether they're trying to help their children overcome obesity. These are big challenges for people, and this book can offer suggestions, a toolbox of sorts, we like to think of it, for people across all of these different areas. And that really was the result of continuing to drop and refine and redo and start from scratch. So by the time the opportunity came to actually write the book, when a publisher bought the proposal, that was the time that I had psychologically thrown in the towel and said, you know what, I tried this. I thought I'd be good at it. Looks like I'm not, with 9 copies of this literally scattered around the floor around my desk. But then I got a phone call one day saying that Ballantine Books, a subsidiary of Random House, was put an offer, and I didn't even know that it was on the market. So I feel very fortunate to have had that experience. But I was also terrified because the moment that I got that phone call, I was holding my 1-month-old son, my very first child, my only child. And I was completely overwhelmed with that experience. I was still the director of a very large research lab at New York University and still had all of those responsibilities, because your life as a researcher doesn't stop when you have a child. The idea of maternity leave does not actually apply to a research career. And so this thing that I had been working on for so long, like the opportunity was now, and it really couldn't come at a worse time, where everybody would say like, all of my advisors and friends told me the only thing that you shouldn't do with this book is try to write it in your first year of your son's life. And they gave me 12 months from when he was 1 month old to write this book.
Amazing.
So again, scrappiness was important here. And because the book is about goal setting and strategies for overcoming obstacles, it really ended up being a personal passion project. I have to figure out how to make this life for me work. And so here are the strategies that I'm offering as possibilities for everybody else. And I try all of them out on myself for another goal that I had set for myself at this challenging time in my life. So there's a bit of that personal narrative and the truth of the science in there, that not all these tactics worked for me at this time that I chose to try them, and some introspection about why that might be. And then the reality that there's no prescription for how to overcome the goal. And if anybody overcome an obstacle to better accomplish our goals, and if anybody said that, they're probably lying, because we are very complicated as a species, and so too are the goals and the challenges that we face. But we can still expand our toolkit, the tools that we have in our toolbox, to help us open up the possibilities for circumventing the obstacles.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you framed the story the way that you did, and I appreciate you sharing it. I can imagine that so many of us can relate, maybe not to writing a book, right, but can relate to that experience of going through a situation, something that we've wanted, something we've invested time in, and we get to that place where we're either stuck or we're just not able to figure out how do we move forward, and to use your words, throwing in the towel, right? So I'm really interested to find out from you specifically, what was the process? How did you frame that at the time? So before you got the call saying that Ballantine Books has made an offer here, and you've decided you're throwing in the towel, what was that process like for you to break through that and continue to forge ahead?
Well, it was luck, honestly, because life presented the opportunity when I thought, there's nothing left to give here. I have nothing left for me to do to increase the odds that this is a success. And then life suggested otherwise. And then how we went from me feeling like there's nothing in this anymore, there's nothing left in this project that is salvageable, to having something that I'm really proud of. Is that new, a fresh perspective came to the table. And the agent was wonderful, and we had worked together for over a year to craft this content. But then the editor brought in a whole different perspective. And so it was a person, that we had maybe 45 minutes on the phone together, and it was really just sussing out, like, what's your style? What's your personality? How do you communicate? How expressive are you, and where do you withhold? And it was realizing, I click with her in a different way than I clicked with my agent. And that just opened up a whole flood of possibilities that, when I had been just taking the left turn every single time with the agent, now somebody came in and said, hey, what if you go right? And I was like, whoa, I had never thought about going right before. But, you just keep going down that rabbit hole, right? And you get into a rut. And even if it's people who are so much smarter than you, like my agent was, they have a particular style, you have a particular style. And the more that you just try to go through that style, it sometimes is helpful to get in a very different perspective. And in terms of her personality and approach, she was very different. And that opened up a whole other host of possibilities.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it amplifies the power of perspective, right? Being able to pull the lens back a bit differently and looking at it through a different set of optics. So thank you.
Absolutely. And this really, it makes me think of this, there's this really fascinating story of Vera Wang. I'm not sure if you want to go into that now, but but when I dug into her more, I was just fascinated to learn of her personal story. I mean, we all know her as this fashion icon, the queen of tulle, right? The iconic wedding dress, this amazing fashion designer who's had this house forever. and has rocked the world with her artistic creations in the world of fashion. But her career actually started in figure skating.
Yeah.
And that was not something I knew until I started to dig into her backstory. And she was very accomplished, actually. She was winning competitions on the national and international stage in doubles and couples figure skating. But she never quite hit that pinnacle peak of what that career could afford her. She was striving to be literally the best in the world, and was just coming up short of that. Now, if this was my child, I would be amazed, right? I would be putting up billboards all over the United States talking about her accomplishments. But she still felt like she was coming up short, and she got to that point too, where it was like, you know what? I just don't think I'm going to be able to pull this off. And it's essentially the equivalent of getting a silver medal at the Olympics. If you look at silver medalists on the podium, what do you see? You don't see them smiling. Actually, they look the saddest on that podium because they're not the gold. And the bronze medalists almost came in fourth and almost didn't get to stand on that podium. And so they're happy also, but it's the silver medalists that have some of the greatest regrets and actually show a lot of despair when they're standing up there. And I haven't talked to Vera Wang about this, but that's sort of what I envision, is that she, kept getting like basically second place in this career. And so what she did is she quit. She quit this career that she had been training her entire life for when she was probably in her early 20s. And she took a sabbatical, went off to Paris, a great place to try to find yourself again, and realized that her real passion was the art of line. And lines get cut, of course, into fabric. Lines are integral to fashion. But lines are also what you draw in the ice as a figure skater. So really, what she's been drawn to her entire life is exploring line and the beauty of line. And she first found that in figure skating, but then after a year realized there's other places to find it. She took a right rather than the left that she had been taking for her entire career to that point, and made the mark on the world that we know of her today.
Well, it's an incredible story. And to your point, I knew nothing about that until, of course, I read your book. And it's again, another powerful lesson in knowing when to stop, pivot, and adapt and look at doing something differently. And we're going to talk about that and tack on to that story here in just a moment. So, and thank you for sharing that. So let's dig into the tools in this toolbox. And the first tool that I'd like you to speak to, if you will, is narrowing our focus of attention. So if you could you give us an example of how this can be applied and why it works?
Well, really, this research started outside of the organizational or business context, so I think it definitely applies there too. And I'll get to that. But I first started studying this with runners. I had the chance to interview some of the world's fastest runners, some Olympic athletes, the fastest man out of Tobago, and some gold medal winners out of Nigeria. And they were fascinating because, first of all, they're the humblest people I'd ever met, even though they are definitely the most accomplished athletes that I've ever crossed paths with. And I was asking them, when you're trying to maintain your motivation and when you're trying to pick up the pace and that goal is near, you can see the finish line, what are you focusing on? And my intuition was that they're going to be focused on the competition, that they have like this amazing tracking ability to know where they stand within the pack that they're competing against. And I was absolutely wrong. That's not at all what they do. All of them said that the strategy for success there, to cross over that finish line, maintain the motivation, and keep that pace, is to really stay focused. They almost have blinders on their eyes. They aren't tracking the competition. They don't know who's on their left or right. They've just kept their eyes on the prize, if you will. And that really surprised me. That I was wrong doesn't surprise me, but it would definitely went against my intuition of what these elite athletes would be doing. But I wondered, like, is this a strategy that's just unique and helpful to these accomplished athletes? And the answer was no, because we took that strategy and we taught people how to use that. We taught people who are, pretty strong runners. They have a frequent running routine that they follow, and people who are really struggling to just get a mile even at walking. And we taught them the strategy that these Olympic athletes say that they use to assume sort of a narrowed focus of attention. Imagine there's a spotlight just shining on your finish line, and that you can't really see anything that's in the periphery. And the people who use that strategy that we taught them, rather than what they naturally do, which is pay more attention to the peripheral vision and the surroundings that they are working within, those people who use narrowed focus of attention, they walked and ran 23% faster. Now, that's the difference between barely qualifying for the Berlin Marathon and breaking the marathon's record. I mean, of course, that's over 26 miles, but that's a significant increase in pace. And what was also interesting was that they said that it hurt 17% less. It took 17% less out of them physically to do this exercise. The exercise was exactly the same. The distance we were having them run and walk was exactly the same, but psychologically there was a difference. And what happened was that finish line, now there was an illusion of proximity. That goal looked closer to them, and that was motivating. It now doesn't seem impossibly far off. It seems like something that I can muster the reserves for to cross over. And so that's what led that change in their psychology, by seeing that goal as more proximal, as closer than it actually was, and closer than they would have seen it otherwise, is what led them to increase their pace, and it didn't hurt as much. And when that happens, when their experience defies their expectations, like it did, then that's motivating and sustaining in the long run. So when we taught other people that strategy and told them, go ahead and use this for a week, and we were tracking their physical activity on a smartphone application, what we found was that they went out for more walks, they took more steps, they sustained that faster pace, even when we, weren't in front of them in the lab with our white coats on.
Okay.
Because it defied their expectations and this was a better experience than they expected it would be, they could sustain it for the long run. So that's some of the work that we started with, the power of narrowed attention here. We can sort of extrapolate from that and find applications more broadly. So the idea here is that by narrowing our focus of attention, keeping our eyes on that prize, focusing on the goal, produces an illusion of proximity. It contracts that distance separating us where we are right now and us in the future. And there's other forms of distance besides a track or besides the street that we're out walking on, but you can think of distance in terms of time also, right?
Right.
And so when we think about time and temporal distance, keeping that focus of attention can also help us stay motivated and keep that energy up for things that we might be having to accomplish in the far off future. So a great example is like saving for retirement. Every analyst will tell you you should start small and start early, and that there really isn't a way to make up for that, right? Because of the way compound interest works, that if we start in our 40s or our 50s and put aside even 10 times as much money, we won't have as much in our retirement years as if we had saved far less but started in our 20s. But nobody does that in their 20s, right? No one's saving for their retirement. And when I surveyed 60 of my students who were on the brink of graduating from college, all of them had jobs to pay their tuition and their bills. But asked them, are you saving any of your money for retirement? All of them said, hell no. No. 60 of 60 said no. And when I asked them why, they all, the most common answer was because that just seems so far away.
Yeah.
So they're telling us the same thing that people who are struggling to exercise are saying. That finish line just seems so far away. It's not relevant now. But when we found ways to induce a narrowed focus of attention on that distant future, it brought that retired self, that image of what I'm going to be like, what my life will be like in the future, it brought it closer. And then when I asked them again, after they had that experience, will you start saving for retirement? They, the majority of them said, yeah, I get it now.
Amazing.
Because that distant far off future is now here, real in front of me.
So share briefly what the experiment that you use, because it is fascinating.
Thanks. I made this demonstration for my students to try to land this point, modeling it off of research that Hal Hirschfeld at UCLA has done. And what I did was take a picture of my students' faces. I used some fun software, computer software, and I morphed their face with that of an older person. So I took this, 20-year-old African-American female student of mine's face and morphed it with Maya Angelou. So she could see for herself, my student could see what she would look like with slightly whiter hair and a little bit more wrinkles on her face. Did the same thing for some of my male students, morphed them with Dan Rather, so they could visually see what that retired self might look like. Now, all of them were horrified. Some of them lost their breath and couldn't breathe. Actually, that male student said, "I think it actually looked pretty good."
Of course.
But he was the exception. But what that experience did was create a visualization. They could see what that future self would look like, and they could relate to it in a concrete way, which they'd never had the experience of doing before. And then I had them walk through, what would the day in the life of your retired self be? And so they did some visualization with that as well. And that was the experience of that I was trying to induce, that narrowed focus on the future. And they were reporting that it now didn't seem so far off. That distant future seemed a little bit closer and more relevant to the here and now.
Yeah, it is incredible, the results that you received from that. And I can see where, like in my own practice working with clients, where we're trying to create the image of the future state of the business. So today, where at this particular point, their goals and objectives are for them to be somewhere else, right? They want to improve in certain areas. So if we can show them visually what that future state looks like and get the emotion and the motivation behind it, we found that we have much better success in actually executing on the goals and moving forward to goal achievement. So it somewhat echoes the research that you did there. That it truly is fascinating. So the second tool is understanding how to materialize a goal, our steps, and our progress. So can you walk us through that strategy?
That principle of materializing really lies at the heart of what these strategies have in common, which is the power of our vision, the power of sight. That there is something really remarkable about how we are seeing the world around us, that isn't shared by any other way that we come to understand and think about the world. We oftentimes are listening to people, we're in a conversation and we know we didn't quite hear them right, or we know we're feeling something, or we're tasting something at a fancy restaurant and we can't quite pick up on what it is that we're experiencing. You don't know all of the spices that went into this entree. You don't quite know what that texture is. Is it silk or is it polyester, if you haven't seen the tag? So all these other ways that we understand the world, we realize the fallibility. We realize that we get it wrong. But almost never do we get that experience with vision. We look at the world rarely changes before us. I know that I am talking to you, Jay, and you are not going to become my mother. I will never have that experience. Well, all of a sudden I thought I was having a conversation with somebody and I was completely wrong about that. We don't have these moments in our life where our reliance and our belief that what we see is true is undermined in the way that it is for everything else. So we come to trust our visual experiences in ways that we don't any other source of information. So there's great power in our experience of sight. And we can use that power to our advantage when we materialize aspects of goal setting. Now, that's all pretty lofty. That's like science talk, right? About the philosophy of vision. But here's a concrete example. And you can think about your calendar. You can think about how you schedule your day and what you actually get done in your day. Mm-hmm. Now, what do we put in our calendar? We put appointments with our boss. We put appointments or big meetings in our calendar. We set aside 90 minutes or 15 minutes, whatever it warrants. We put in appointments with doctors, and rarely do we miss those. I mean, of course we do, but think about what we don't put in our calendar. Those things that might be like, I need to call my great aunt, Sarah Ann, right? Those are the things that we're more likely to forget, the things that we don't put in our calendar. There's power in visualizing. There's power in materializing. The things we put in our calendar, we're far more likely to do than the things that we just leave in our mind. Those things in our mind might be just as important, but oftentimes it's the personal stuff that we don't schedule into our day the same way we do our professional obligations. And we, as a result, are more likely to meet our professional obligations than maybe those personal commitments or the personal to-do list that we might otherwise just leave in our mind. And I think that comes because we prioritize what we see. We look at our calendar, we look at our schedule, our day planner, and those are our goals. That is what we're working towards to accomplish in the day. And if there's extra time, then maybe we turn to our mental to-do list. but that's not as concrete or clear or at top of mind and top of sight the way our physical calendar is. And as a result, we often forget or don't get to it, and have these personal obligations sort of nagging. So that's my advice, is that these things for our personal life actually are as important as our professional life. Our physical and mental well-being actually is as important as making sure we hit that meeting with our boss. We can't show up to the meeting with the boss if we are too mentally or physically unwell to get there. So why don't we prioritize our personal commitments and goals in the same way that we do our professional ones, and make sure we put into our calendar those things that are on our minds that never quite seem to make it into our calendar.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Does it make a difference, just out of curiosity, whether we use a written calendar or an electronic calendar?
That's a good question. To be honest, as a scientist, I always want to answer with data. And in this case, I don't have data. I just have personal stories. So with COVID, I've been trying that out for myself, because I always use electronic calendars so that all of my life is synced with every place I might find myself. All of my computers in my office and at home sync with my phone and with all of my electronic devices. And that's really important. And I bet a lot of people do the same thing, that they rely on an electronic calendar. But when life got really stressful again, with coronavirus shutting down our world, including my 4-year-old son's school, life got crazy in a way that I was totally blindsided by. And I had so much less time, as I bet so many people also feel, with the uncertainty and the quick changes, even if you don't have a child, that coronavirus has brought, is that we have to have an instant adaptability that probably none of us were really prepared for. And so I bet a lot of us have felt that time is just weird right now. And for me personally, what it meant was that I just never felt like I was getting anything done.
Hmm.
That, of course, I had less time because now I was homeschooling, and he required a lot more of my attention than he had before. I got to rely on the teachers for all the help with that. But I still had all the same responsibilities professionally. My professional life didn't let up, even though my schedule got a lot more constricted now. And every night I was going to bed feeling incredibly anxious, and I was sleeping only half the number of hours, which doesn't help with productivity, because of that anxiety. And what I realized was that my electronic calendar just wasn't doing it for me.
Hmm.
I wasn't missing my obligations. It's just it wasn't bringing me a sense of reward that I needed to reduce my anxiety.
Okay.
So in the last 6 months, I have simultaneously started using a paper calendar. And so I took one of those yearly planners. I hadn't used it at all, so the first 3 months were completely blank. But I started also scheduling into that calendar. And yes, it was redundant in some regards, that what appeared in my electronic calendar was also shared in my paper calendar. But I could see it in a way that like reading a paper book is different than reading on a Kindle. And it sunk into my brain in a different way. And I could cross things out in a way that my electronic calendars don't do. And that was rewarding, to see my things crossed out. And I bet a lot of people resonate with that. That's why they create to-do lists. They like crossing things out. That was never a thing for me. I never got any sense of reward. And I was getting some reward from seeing the crossing out now, but importantly, I never tore out one of those pages in my paper calendar. And every month or so, I would go back, or if the wind blew the pages, then I could see every week and see how much I had gotten done.
Hmm.
And so even though in the day, it felt like, oh my God, what happened to the day? Where did all the time go? Nothing happened today. That can be a problem of just staying focused on the day. But when you get to look at your life in a week, or you look at your life in a month and you see all that you've crossed out, at least for me, it brought a sense of calm and productivity and perspective that an electronic calendar hasn't been bringing me. And it helps reduce some of the anxiety that COVID has brought my world.
Yeah, that is super interesting. And I wonder how that applies to a larger data set. And I mean, here that's coming from your experiences, and I could see that being the case. I'm guessing that my wife would probably echo your point, because it seems like she would prefer the written calendar versus an electronic calendar. But yeah, that's really an interesting experiment to work through. So let's talk about the third tool, which is controlling our frame of reference. So can you unpack that strategy for us?
Controlling our frame of reference really is the idea to bring that perspective that we have control of what we look at, and what we look at has a huge effect on what we think and what we do. So we can be conscientious about where we're pointing our camera, if you will liken our visual experience to a camera. We have control over that. And as a result, we have great power over something that predicts what we think and what we do. There's a great story that I feel like really resonates with me. I came upon this very cool collaboration. They are two women. One is British and is living in New York City. The other one is a New Yorker who's living in London. They both have this really incredible career that's sort of the hybrid of data science, visual arts, marketing, and storytelling. And they found each other at a conference, I guess, for people who live in this space. They didn't know each other at all. They just met at one night and they said, you know what, let's work together. I mean, they decided that on the spot, having probably just had a very short conversation where they learned each other's names and these interesting similarities in their life about their swapped live experiences. But not only did they start working together, they at that moment made a commitment that they are going to work together every moment of their waking day every day for the next 52 weeks for an entire year. And they accomplished that. So that's amazing, right? Because I've gone on like plenty of dates in New York City, especially where I couldn't commit to the person for 52 minutes, let alone a stranger to commit to for 52 weeks. So I was amazed by their personal story. And so I talked with them to learn more about how they did that and what they did. So what they did was that every week they would choose a theme, and it might be compliments, or it might be the phrase, I love you, or it might be street rats. Weird stuff, right? Very eclectic stuff. And what they were doing was counting the number of times they gave or received a compliment, counting the number of times they saw a rat in their life. And so every moment of their waking day, they were on guard for this thing that they were tracking this week. They took extensive notes about, did I give that compliment? Did I receive it? What was the nature of the relationship between me and the compliment giver or receiver? What were the words? What was happening at this time? They were keeping extensive notes about these experiences. At the end of the week, they would collate that data and then turn it into a postcard, this beautiful picture, this beautiful work of art that they hand drew on the back of a postcard. And it might be things like, it would look like a field of wildflowers, but the length of the stem of that flower indicated something about perhaps the number of compliments that they received. The color of the flower might indicate the relationship they had with the person who gave or received the compliment. So every little bit of that visualization reflected something about the data that they had collected. And on the flip side of the postcard, then they left a key, a notation, so that the other person could understand it and decode what this basically Excel sheet was telling this person about what their life was like. So they got to know each other so well through this artistic rendition of very black and white data about what their daily life was like. Okay, so the part that really fascinated me was how they kept doing this for 52 weeks, this exhausting thing every day for 52 weeks. And when I asked Georgia Lupi about that, the British woman living in New York City, she was just like, because I said that I would. And I thought, well, that's not how I live my life. Like my life, I tell myself, okay, I'm going to do this thing. And sometimes it happens, but oftentimes it doesn't. And I need more to it to make it happen. And so having read about their lives, I thought, maybe Stephanie Posavec, the collaborator in this experience, a New Yorker living in London, she probably has a different take. And I asked her and she said, oh yeah, like nobody's as organized as Georgia. Georgia is just this amazing mind that very few people have. And she said it was hard. And for me, what motivated me through all of this was that every Tuesday, this postcard would appear on my doorstep, on the inside of my foyer area, that she had one of those old-fashioned mail slots. A postman could put the card through her front door and it would land in this pile on the top of her mail, but within a doormat. She said it was that doormat that really did it for me, because when I would come home, I would see framed up in this doormat this postcard that my new friend had spent so much time making for me that it meant I have to do this for her. So for her, the frame, that visual frame, was this doormat that provided a motivation to keep going. And this visual remembrance and this visual motivator, it was literally seeing this thing framed up that kept her going.
Incredible.
It really is. And their postcards are so fascinating and so beautiful. They're turned into a book called Dear Data, and the Museum of Modern Art actually acquired their entire collection. So you can see that on MoMA's website, see their artistic renditions. It's amazing.
That is so cool. Oh, what an amazing story.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the fourth tool, which is to widen the bracket. Now, I will share with you that this is one that I continue to work on, right? It's one that I have to just keep reinforcing the message. So tell us about this tool and why is it important, and also why does it work?
I'm going to explain the wide bracket by juxtaposing it against the narrowed frame, because by words they seem like opposite suggestions, and in fact they are. So my little asterisk here is that, again, these are all just tools that we have available to us that we need to use flexibly. So if you think about building a house, you wouldn't be able to build a house with just a hammer. That, maybe it would work, but there's probably other tools that are going to help you get the jobs done better that are required for building a house. And the same is true with setting goals, that we need a flexibility and we need a diversity within our toolkit. And so we have the narrow frame and we have the wide bracket. The narrow frame doesn't work all the time, right? The examples I gave are when people had a goal in sight, or they needed to make that goal look like it was in sight. They needed that experience of proximity, like the people who are trying to save for retirement. They needed to be able to see that finish line as closer, or for the Olympic athletes, it actually was in sight and they found a motivation by seeing it as even closer, by focusing on it. But if we keep that narrowed focus all the time, it's going to be exhausting, right? Like having that hyper vigilant focus for where we want to be is not going to be effective at all points in time. And in fact, when we work with some very elite runners and we ask them, when you're running 26 miles, do you keep that narrowed focus of attention? They say no. Actually, they do the opposite, right? When starting out, they want a breadth. They want to widen their perspective and see all the different ways forward that they could go to navigate around the competition. They actually aren't so hyper narrowly focused. And if we think about that in other aspects of our life, it would be exhausting to say we have a 6-month goal. We can't spend 6 months just trying to cross that finish line every single day and sustain that kind of intensity that people experience when they're in the last 100 meters of their race, right? So the narrowed focus is great for when we need that extra boost to push us over the finish line, or we need the incentive to get started maybe in the first place by bringing that finish line in closer. Mm-hmm. But sometimes we need a wide bracket, right? And the wide bracket is the idea that if we step back and, quite literally, well, maybe metaphorically, see the forest rather than the tree, that we can find new ways forward. I worked with a group of women that were all professional women in very different ways. Some were at very competitive law firms. Others were starting their own businesses. Some were executives in other domains. And they were all at this crossroads. They had accomplished a lot in their life. They were probably in their mid-30s, early 40s, and still were left wanting something. They didn't feel like maybe they had gotten all out of the education that they wanted. Maybe some were contemplating switching law firms to a whole different type of law. So major choice points in their life, and we were struggling with it. Mm-hmm. Now, we created this experience that would induce this wide bracket in a way of thinking and seeing the different options in their life in a way that they hadn't experienced before. It was a social experiment. So there were some aspects of it that followed the principles of science, but then some that were just kind of for fun. So there's a 2-part experience. We had them at home telling us what's the most important aspects of your life. What do you want to accomplish in those aspects of your life? Is your career more important? Are your family obligations most important? And what looks like the ideal in that space? And then a couple of weeks later, we sent them an invitation and said, hey, show up at this store in this posh neighborhood in New York City. And we didn't tell them what for, but we said, bring a friend that's really important to you and that you rely on for making decisions. Okay. They were brave souls. They showed up at this store, not knowing what this was about. And what we had created was a pop-up shop where they could where they could curate the perfect life for themselves. So like when they walked in, the first thing on the left was a shelf with a big title over the top called kids. And they saw different bags that said 0 kids, 1 kid, 2 kids, 3 kids, 4+ kids. I gave them a basket and they could go shop. Which bag represents what would be ideal? What would be the perfect life when you think about your kids? Or over on the right was, what does your living situation look like? Living with friends, living alone, living with a partner, living with parents. And they could choose which canister reflected what would be the ideal in that aspect of life. And there was about 25 different sort of spaces in the shop where they could make these choices. And then they came to the checkout, and that I was standing at the checkout. And what they didn't realize was that I had all of their responses from when they responded in private. And I could compare to what their responses looked like in their shopping basket when they were there with their friends that were having these conversations about like, do you really want 2 kids? That's not what you'd said before. Do you really want to be living alone? Because you're never happy when you're alone. So they were having these conversations as they were shopping, and we could compare them. When you told us what in private, what your ideal life looked like, how does that compare against now when you've had the social support sort of influencing your experiences? Now, this was the wide bracket experience because rarely do we ever think about all aspects of our life simultaneously. As we're thinking about how many hours do I want to work in a week, we're not oftentimes making the trade-off of, well, what does that mean for who lives in the house that I live in? Or what does that mean for how many hours I can do? If I do yoga this many hours and maintain my mental health through meditation and through yoga, what does that mean for my ability to finish up my PhD? You know, some of these trade-offs are a little bit more obvious, but oftentimes they're not. But shopping in this store made that experience visual and concrete because they were trying to fit one canister reflecting children up in the space in their shopping basket compared to all the other things that they had already selected for what their ideal life looked like. And so they had to navigate this space thinking about all aspects of their life in ways that, you know, people just don't do. As we have, you know, the fires of today command our attention, we're trying to work on what's most pressing or salient right now and make a decision when that decision opportunity becomes available. But oftentimes don't go through that process of thinking through all the iterations and trade-offs and consequences that would fall out from making this one decision. Yeah. But that's what this shop did. And what we found was that in this experience of taking this wide bracket perspective on what would my ideal life look like, especially in consultation with these important social support systems, these people in their life, was that the majority of people, over 85% of people, made more ambitious decisions in that context when they had taken this wide bracket in the store. They said, you know what, I'm actually going for that last degree when they didn't say that in private. And importantly, that what these conversations did was push people to make more ambitious decisions in those domains that they had identified themselves personally as being the most important facets of their life. So that was a lot, I know, that I just said, but the takeaway here is that we can and we should give ourselves the opportunity to think globally, to think broadly about what do I want in my personal and my professional life, and to think about those trade-offs that would get made across domains that maybe we don't normally sort of cross-reference. And when we find those people in our lives that do have our back, that are supportive, we can rely on them and trust that they actually aren't going to push us to have it all or to conform to a stereotype. That idea about what maybe, for example, female relationships are like aren't necessarily true, that really our social support systems are a gain for us. And that we can put aside our own personal experiences to help advance the goals and ideals that others, especially our close friends and family, have.
Well, that is really interesting, and it also amplifies the importance of surrounding yourself with others who you like, that you trust, right, and are focused on the greater good, but focused on your best interests as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I like really the idea of a personal board of directors. I think that's something that we could all integrate in our life, right? So in corporate America, of course, there's boards of directors, but why not have that for our own personal ambitions as well?
There you go. That's exactly right. So How has social media affected our view of the world and colored our frame of reference?
Well, it gives us a distorted perspective of what the world is really like. And I think it highlights the dangers of social comparison.
Mm,
So, we are a human species, and especially in America, we're among the most competitive, individualistic cultures out there in the world. And what that means is that oftentimes we find ourselves working for our own individual pursuits and have sort of this fixed pie mentality that what somebody else gains means that there'll be fewer resources for ourselves. And so if somebody else's success doesn't necessarily feel good for us because we might have that mindset that it means there's less room for me to win. And I think that's proved advantageous for American culture because it can spirit innovation and creativity, and but it's also bad because, especially when coupled with social media, because we don't really know what the competition is experiencing. Of course, there's false representation. People can lie on social media, and we might be able to catch that a little bit more easier than the alternative, which is that people might curate the experiences that they present on social media. And that might not be something that we can have insight to. We don't know what we don't know. If it's not up on social media, we may not know that there's a whole other life that this person is experiencing.
yeah.
But this sort of fundamental, almost human tendency to compare where am I at against where are they at can be dangerous when we don't actually have the complete story of what somebody else has experienced and what their life is like. So really, this is something that I think we all struggle with is how do we assess our own progress? How do we assess performance? If what I'm suggesting is that comparing ourselves to other people or other organizations may not be a healthy way to do that, or might actually not even give us the right information that we need to do that accurately. And I think the best advice is that we really only should compare against our past selves, our own past performance, and our future intentions, where we want to be, and track that change. How far have I come since when I've started, and how far do I have to go before I get where I want to be?
Mm,
And that we have full insight into, right? We might not know where people have failed if they don't present their failures on social media, which we know that they don't, and that they're far more likely to present their successes. And so if we don't really know the full picture of somebody else's lived experience, we get more insight into that when we just use ourselves as a standard of comparison.
yeah, I love that. That's a great approach to take. So for those listening and watching, compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not comparing yourself to what you see on social media or those that are around you. Use that as inspiration, but not the comparison. Excellent. So we're going to have to schedule round two because there are so many areas that you dive into that I want to dive into with you. So, for sake of time, what message would you like to leave our audience with?
That failure isn't failure, right? We should scrap that word from our lexicon because it's demotivating and it does an injustice to our hard work and our efforts that we are putting towards meeting our goals. Instead, I hope that we can all adopt a mindset of growth and possibility and sort of embrace those stumbling blocks and obstacles that we might otherwise have called failures, but instead as seeing them as an opportunity for renewal, for an opportunity for reinvention, to try something different because clearly what we tried wasn't successful, and to not sort of put a scarlet letter A on ourselves when we experience those obstacles, but instead see them as just part of the learning process and part of a necessary step for innovation and improvement. We can embrace those failures and, in fact, just find a different word for them instead.
Beautifully said. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, and I will be asking you a final question, but where can our audience go to engage with you?
LinkedIn, Instagram, my own website. I'm the only Emily Balchutis in the world. I'm pretty easy to track down.
All right, fantastic. Well, we will link to those platforms in the show notes. So here is my final question to you. Speaking of reframing failure, so what are 2 to 3 lessons that you've learned from obstacles that have had the greatest impact on you personally?
That I have learned that I have a faulty memory, and that for me personally, which I bet others share, is that my mind focuses on the negative. That I do harp on. I focus on those obstacles that I faced, and I don't give enough credit for the successes or for the probably more incremental progress, steps in progress that I'm making. So for me, the take home when I experienced that, or how I even learned that, was by tracking my progress for a month on something that really mattered to me, learning to play drums when my son was a few months old. And I felt that I was terrible at it, and I was pretty terrible. But I also thought that it wasn't making any progress, but I actually was. When I looked over the course of a month, when I tracked, did I practice and how did I feel? At first it was not enough and terrible, but over the course of the month, the terrible and the swear words that I had noted sort of dropped off. But it didn't feel that way because that's my faulty brain. That's the way my brain works, is to give too much weight to the negative and not enough attention to the positive. So that's one lesson, is that perhaps that resonates with you too. Perhaps you're not giving yourself enough attention for what might be more incremental progress that's harder to see. But when you step back and take a wider perspective, you might be able to notice progress that you can't feel. Another thing that I realized is that a go-to strategy for me is multitasking. And multitasking, as I dug into it, it didn't feel right when my son was first born, and I was trying to write this book and hold down my research lab and still have all my personal obligations. I realized that multitasking wasn't effective because even when my son was just a few weeks old, I could see that he saw me looking at my phone, and I thought, this is not the world I want to bring him into, where he even knows so early in his life that my mind isn't with him and that it's somewhere else. So I dug into the literature on multitasking and realized that it is beneficial and it is not beneficial. And it's about learning how to use multitasking for yourself in the situation that you're in optimally. And there are times when we need to be engaged more, when our brain isn't challenged enough, and multitasking is great then. But in my case, my brain was challenged a lot and it was not being served by multitasking, and that I made a lot more progress and I was happier in all ways by toning down the multitasking. And that's shared by a lot of people as well, that there is a tipping point when the benefits of multitasking are no longer there. And in fact, you just incur greater costs.
I feel you on both of those. No question about it. Well, thank you. And Emily, thank you so much for joining us today on Business Minds Coffee Chat. It has been an absolute pleasure, and I appreciate you, and I appreciate you being here and sharing your insights, your research, and your talents with the rest of the world.
Thanks so much. This has been a real pleasure to chat with you. Appreciate your questions and your interest.
Absolutely. And for the rest of you, thank you very much for watching. And if you found value in this episode, you know what to do. Go ahead and like and share with your friends. And also, please do us a favor and subscribe to this channel. And until next time, stay healthy and optimistic. Keep learning and growing, and then read and apply the learnings from Clearer, Closer, Better. And remember that transformative change in your life and business always begins with you, and nothing happens until you take action. And we'll see you on the next episode of Business Minds Coffee Chat. Take care.